It happened during the last week of October in 2023, and even now I still avoid driving at night because of it. I know people say trauma changes you, but this wasn't just trauma. It felt like I accidentally crossed paths with something I was never supposed to see. Something that had probably been happening for years without anyone noticing. I've told this story to a few people in real life, and most either think I'm exaggerating or assume I was hallucinating from exhaustion. I wish that were true. Honestly, I'd rather believe I imagined the whole thing than accept what actually happened that night. At the time, I was 24 and living in Ohio, about 30 minutes outside of Columbus. I worked for a plumbing supply company that delivered parts to construction sites around the state. The hours were long, and because we were understaffed, I was constantly being asked to take extra routes. The pay was decent enough that I usually agreed. That Friday, my manager called asking if I could cover a late-night emergency delivery to a small town about 2 hours away. One of the contractors needed equipment first thing in the morning, and apparently I was the only driver available. I almost said no because it was already close to 8 p.m., but I needed the overtime money, so I agreed. The route itself was mostly highway until the last 40 minutes, where it turned into these long, isolated back roads surrounded by woods and farmland. It had been raining earlier that evening, and by the time I got out there, the roads were still wet and reflective under the headlights. I remember feeling unusually uneasy the farther I drove. It wasn't fear exactly, just this growing discomfort like I was being watched. I kept brushing it off because I'd listened to horror stories during the drive, and I figured my imagination was just running wild. Around 11 p.m., I passed through a tiny town that looked almost abandoned. There was one gas station still open, so I stopped to grab coffee and use the bathroom. Inside, there was an older woman working the register. I asked her if the construction site I was delivering to was still another 20 minutes away. The second I mentioned the road name, her expression changed. She looked genuinely uncomfortable. She asked why I was heading out there so late, and I explained about the delivery. She hesitated for a second before quietly saying, "Don't stop for anybody on that road." I actually laughed because I thought she was joking, but she didn't smile back. She just repeated it again. "If you see someone out there, don't stop." I remember leaving the gas station feeling creeped out, but at the same time I figured that maybe there'd been robberies or something. Rural towns always have weird rumors. I got back on the road and kept driving. About 15 minutes later, my GPS lost signal. That wasn't unusual out there, but it still annoyed me because the roads kept splitting into different directions. Eventually, I found the right turn and ended up on this narrow road surrounded completely by forest. No houses, no lights, nothing. Just trees and darkness. The rain started again lightly, tapping against the windshield. That's when I first saw the person. At first, I thought it was a deer standing near the shoulder because the shape looked awkward and unnatural in the headlights. But as I got closer, I realized it was a woman. She was standing completely still near the edge of the road, wearing what looked like a gray hoodie. Her head was tilted downward so I couldn't see her face. I immediately remembered what the cashier had said, "Don't stop for anybody on that road." My stomach tightened, but I kept driving. As I passed her, she suddenly lifted her head toward my truck. I only saw her face for maybe a second, but something about it felt wrong. Not physically deformed or anything like that, just empty, completely emotionless, and pale, extremely pale. I looked in my side mirror as I drove past, expecting to see her disappear behind me, but instead she was standing in the middle of the road now, watching my truck drive away. That image bothered me more than I can explain. I tried convincing myself she probably needed help and I was overreacting, but deep down, something about her felt off. About 5 minutes later, I noticed headlights behind me. That alone wasn't strange, except I hadn't passed a single car in almost 40 minutes. The headlights stayed far back at first, then slowly got closer. I assumed it was another driver heading through the area until the truck suddenly flashed its high beams repeatedly. Then, it started tailgating me aggressively. I was already going close to 60 on a narrow, wet road, but the driver kept getting closer. Eventually, he pulled beside me. It was an old dark pickup truck covered in mud. I couldn't see the driver clearly because the windows were tinted, but I noticed the passenger side window was halfway down. A man leaned slightly out and yelled something I couldn't hear over the rain and engines. Then he pointed behind my truck. At first, I thought something had fallen out of the bed, but when I checked my mirror, I felt my chest drop. There was someone sitting in the back of my truck. I swear on everything this is true. A person was crouched near the tailgate, staring directly at me through the rear window. I nearly drove off the road. I slammed the brakes instinctively, but the pickup beside me sped ahead suddenly like they wanted nothing to do with whatever they'd seen. The person in the back of my truck didn't move. I could barely breathe. My mind kept trying to rationalize it, but there was no explanation. I hadn't stopped anywhere except the gas station. Nobody could have climbed into the truck without me noticing. I accelerated again, panicking now, trying to think of what to do. I considered pulling over, but every instinct in my body told me not to. Then the figure slowly stood up in the truck bed. It was the same woman from the roadside. Even through the rain and darkness, I recognized the hoodie and pale face. She stood there, holding onto the sides of the truck while staring through the back window directly at me. Her expression never changed. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but there was no signal. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. I started speeding, hoping the sudden movement would throw her off the truck, but she somehow kept her balance perfectly. Then she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile either. It stretched unnaturally wide across her face like she was forcing it. I felt physically sick looking at her. A few seconds later, she lifted one hand and pointed toward the woods beside the road. That's when I saw them. There were people standing between the trees, dozens of them, just barely visible whenever my headlights swept across the forest. They weren't moving. They were simply standing there watching the road. Some looked like men, some women, but all of them were completely still. I remember this overwhelming feeling that I was trapped, like I'd entered somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. Then suddenly, the woman slammed both hands against the rear window so hard, I heard the glass crack. I screamed, swerving across the road. My truck clipped the shoulder and nearly rolled into a ditch before I regained control. I didn't stop driving after that. I just kept going as fast as possible. After another few minutes, I finally saw lights ahead. A small intersection with a closed diner and an empty parking lot. The second my truck entered the lighted area, the woman disappeared from the back. I don't mean she jumped off, I mean she was just suddenly gone. I slammed the truck into park and jumped out despite the rain. The truck bed was empty. Completely empty. But the rear window had two massive cracked handprints on the glass. I stood there shaking, trying to process what had happened. Then I heard another engine approaching. It was the same muddy pickup truck from earlier. This time, it pulled into the parking lot beside me. There were two men inside, probably in their late 40s or 50s. Both looked terrified. The passenger rolled down his window and asked if she touched the truck. The fact he said she made my blood run cold. I asked them what the hell was happening, and the driver just shook his head before telling me I needed to leave the area immediately. He said people around there had been seeing them for years along those roads, especially late at night. Travelers would report people standing in the woods or trying to wave cars down. Sometimes they'd climb onto vehicles. Sometimes people disappeared entirely. I thought they were messing with me until the passenger quietly told me his brother vanished on that same road in 2011. They never found him. No car, no body, nothing. Before I could ask anything else, the driver looked past me suddenly toward the trees behind the diner. His face immediately changed. He just whispered, "Get in your truck right now." I turned around and saw movement near the edge of the woods. Figures. At least 6 or 7 people standing under the trees watching us. The same motionless posture. The same pale faces. One of them looked like the woman from earlier. The men in the pickup sped away instantly. I jumped back into my truck and followed them without even shutting my door properly at first. I didn't look back again until I reached the highway nearly 30 minutes later. The entire drive home, I kept checking my mirrors expecting to see someone in the truck bed again. When I finally got back to my apartment around 3 a.m., I noticed muddy handprints smeared across the tailgate. Small handprints, human handprints. I reported everything to the police the next day, leaving out the parts that sounded insane. They checked the road and basically told me there was no evidence of anyone being out there. One officer even suggested stress and exhaustion might have caused me to imagine things. But I know what I saw. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me, and I started researching disappearances in that area. There were more than I expected. Missing hikers, drivers abandoning vehicles, unsolved cases stretching back years. I even found an old forum post from someone describing pale people standing near the road at night in almost the exact same location. After that, I stopped looking into it completely. I haven't driven through that town since. I transferred routes at work and eventually quit the job altogether. But sometimes late at night, I still think about the way those people stood in the woods, completely still, just watching. And the part that scares me most is realizing the woman never actually tried to hurt me directly. It almost felt like she was guiding me somewhere. Like if I had stopped the truck that first time I saw her, I probably would have followed them willingly into those woods, and nobody ever would have seen me again. I used to think home security cameras were mostly just for catching package thieves or checking on pets while you were at work. After what happened to me 2 years ago, I don't think I could ever live in a house without cameras again. Even then, sometimes I wonder if having them actually made things worse. Because if I hadn't seen the footage myself, I probably could have convinced myself it was all stress or paranoia. Instead, I have recordings sitting on an old hard drive that I still refuse to watch at night. This happened in early December of 2024 when I was living alone in a rental house outside of Portland, Oregon. I was 27 at the time, working remotely for a software company, and honestly, my life was pretty routine. Most of my days were spent inside answering emails, sitting through meetings, and barely leaving the house except for groceries or the gym. The neighborhood itself was quiet. Not rich, not dangerous, just one of those suburban areas where everyone keeps to themselves. The houses were spaced apart enough that you couldn't really hear your neighbors unless someone was mowing their lawn. I'd moved there after a breakup because I wanted somewhere cheap and isolated where I could focus on work and save money. The house had this long gravel driveway leading through trees before opening up to the property. At first, I loved how private it felt. After a while, though, the isolation started getting to me, especially at night. The woods around the house were thick enough that once the sun went down, everything outside looked pitch black beyond the porch lights. About a month after moving in, I installed security cameras around the property because there'd been reports online about people checking car doors in nearby neighborhoods. Nothing major, just precautionary stuff. I had one camera facing the driveway, another at the back patio, one by the garage, and a doorbell camera at the front entrance. For the first few weeks, the cameras mostly picked up raccoons, stray cats, and the occasional deer wandering through the yard. Then, one Thursday night around 1 a.m., I got a motion alert on my phone while I was still awake gaming in the living room. I opened the app expecting another animal, but instead, I saw a person standing at the very end of my driveway near the tree line. At first, I thought maybe someone was lost or drunk. The camera quality wasn't amazing at night, but I could tell it was a tall man wearing dark clothes. What immediately bothered me was how still he was standing. He wasn't walking toward the house. He wasn't looking around. He was just facing directly toward the camera without moving. I watched the live feed for almost 30 seconds before finally grabbing a flashlight and stepping onto the porch. The second I opened the front door, the figure walked backward into the trees and disappeared. Not turned around, not ran, just slowly stepped backward into the darkness. That alone unsettled me enough that I barely slept that night. The next morning, I checked the driveway and found muddy footprints near the edge of the gravel. They stopped exactly where the woods began. I considered calling the police, but technically the guy hadn't done anything illegal. He hadn't approached the house or tried getting inside, so I just convinced myself it was probably some weird trespasser or homeless guy passing through. 2 nights later, another motion alert woke me up around 3 a.m. This time the driveway camera showed someone much closer to the house. My stomach dropped immediately because it looked like the same man, same height, same dark clothes. He was standing halfway down the driveway now, again, completely motionless. I checked the timestamp and realized he'd already been standing there for almost 4 minutes before the camera even notified me. I don't know why, but that detail scared me more than anything. Just imagining him silently standing there in the dark, watching the house. I locked every door, even though they were already locked, and turned on all the exterior lights. When I checked the camera again, maybe 15 seconds later, he was gone. No walking away. No movement caught on camera. Just gone. The next morning, I bought another camera and mounted it higher up near the second floor window, facing the driveway from a different angle. I also told my friend Marcus about everything over the phone. He joked that I was becoming paranoid from living alone too long, but even he admitted the behavior sounded creepy. About a week passed with nothing unusual happening. Then things got worse. It was a Sunday night around 11:30 p.m. when all 4 cameras sent motion alerts at the exact same time. My phone practically exploded with notifications. I remember this immediate wave of panic hitting me because there was no way one person could trigger every camera simultaneously. I opened the app and nearly dropped my phone. There were people around the house, one standing near the garage camera, one near the back patio, one at the driveway, and another directly in front of the doorbell camera staring into it. They were all wearing dark hoodies. None of them moved. I called 911 immediately while turning off every light inside the house so they couldn't see me clearly through the windows. The dispatcher asked if the individuals were attempting entry, but they weren't. They were just standing there, watching the house. The police station was about 15 minutes away, and those 15 minutes felt endless. I stayed crouched behind my kitchen counter watching the camera feeds while the figures remained completely motionless outside. At one point, the person near the front door slowly tilted their head sideways toward the camera. I can't explain why that scared me so badly, but it did. It felt unnatural, like they knew I was watching them through the app. Then suddenly, all 4 figures walked away at the exact same time. Not casually either. They all turned in perfect synchronization and disappeared into the darkness around the property. By the time the police arrived, nobody was there. The officers searched the woods briefly but found nothing besides footprints around the house. One officer actually admitted the situation was disturbing, especially because the people never attempted theft or vandalism. It was almost like intimidation. After that night, I started sleeping with a baseball bat beside my bed. I also began checking the cameras obsessively. Every noise outside made me anxious. I stopped going to the gym at night because I was terrified of coming home and finding someone inside the house. About 3 days later, Marcus came over to stay the weekend because he could tell I was seriously shaken up. That Friday night, we sat in the living room drinking beer and watching movies while joking about how insane the whole situation had become. Around midnight, Marcus asked to see the camera footage. I pulled up the app and started showing him the recordings from earlier in the week. At first, he laughed nervously, but then his expression changed. He paused the video from the driveway camera and zoomed in on the trees behind the figure standing there. There was another face visible deeper in the woods, then another. Once we noticed them, we realized there were multiple people barely visible between the trees in almost every clip. Just standing there watching from farther back, my entire body went cold. We replayed the footage over and over, noticing more details each time. In one clip, a face appeared inches from the side of the garage camera for less than a second before disappearing. In another, someone could be seen crawling low through the backyard near the patio. We hadn't even noticed those things before. Marcus stopped joking after that. Around 2 a.m., while we were still reviewing footage, the power suddenly went out across the entire house. Everything went black instantly, except for the emergency battery light on my modem. At first, I thought it was just a storm outage, until Marcus looked out the front window and quietly said, "There's someone outside." I moved beside him and saw a figure standing on the porch directly outside the glass, just standing there staring into the dark house. Then, another figure appeared near the driveway. Then, another near the garage. My chest tightened so badly I could barely breathe. Marcus grabbed the bat while I called 911 again. This time, the dispatcher could probably hear the panic in my voice. The figure on the porch slowly raised one hand and knocked 3 times on the front door. Calm, soft, almost polite. Then, all the cameras disconnected from the app simultaneously. We heard movement outside the house after that, footsteps on gravel, scratching sounds near the back windows. At one point, someone tried turning the back door handle slowly. Marcus whispered that we should barricade ourselves upstairs, so we locked ourselves inside the bedroom while waiting for police. The worst part was hearing occasional footsteps in different parts of the property without knowing how many people were out there. Eventually, we saw flashing lights through the upstairs window. The footsteps stopped immediately. Police searched the property for over an hour. They found evidence that multiple people had been circling the house, including footprints directly beneath my bedroom window. But again, nobody was caught. Here's the part that still keeps me awake sometimes. The next morning, while reviewing the disconnected footage stored locally on my computer, we found one final recording before the cameras shut off. It showed the man on the porch, standing motionless for almost 2 minutes. Then, he leaned close to the doorbell camera and whispered something. The audio quality was terrible, but after enhancing it several times, we finally understood what he said. He whispered, "We finally found the right house." I moved out less than 2 weeks later. The landlord acted strangely calm about the whole situation, which honestly bothered me almost as much as the incidents themselves. He never seemed surprised. I later learned the previous tenant had suddenly broken their lease after only 4 months. Nobody would tell me why. I still have the footage saved somewhere, though I haven't watched it in over a year. Sometimes I think about deleting it completely, but another part of me keeps it because I'm terrified those people might come back someday, and if they do, I want proof that they were real. The scariest thing that's ever happened to me started with a phone call that I almost ignored. If I'd let it go to voicemail like I usually did with unknown numbers, there's a good chance I would have gone missing that night. I know that sounds dramatic, but after everything that happened, I honestly believe it. This took place in the summer of 2022, when I was living in northern Arizona, about 40 minutes outside of Flagstaff. At the time, I was 25 and working as an overnight stalker for a grocery chain. The schedule completely wrecked my sleep cycle, so on my days off I'd usually stay awake all night gaming or driving around because I couldn't fall asleep normally anymore. That particular Friday had been brutally hot all day, even by Arizona standards. Around midnight, I decided to take a drive out toward one of the forest roads near Mormon Lake just to clear my head. I used to do that a lot because the roads out there were empty and quiet at night. You could pull over, sit on the hood of your car, and see more stars than you'd ever see in the city. It always helped me relax. Before leaving town, I stopped at a convenience store for drinks and snacks. I remember there being this older guy standing near the coffee machines watching me in a way that immediately made me uncomfortable. Not staring exactly, but paying way too much attention to me. When I walked past him, he smiled and asked where I was headed so late. I just shrugged and said I was driving around. He nodded slowly and said, "Be careful out there tonight." At the time, I thought it was just small talk. Now I'm not so sure. About 30 minutes later, I was deep into the forest roads with absolutely nobody around. My phone barely had service, and the only sounds were crickets and the occasional wind through the trees. I parked near this small clearing off the road where people sometimes camped. There weren't any other vehicles there, which honestly I preferred. I reclined my seat, turned the radio low, and just sat there looking out through the windshield. Everything felt peaceful for maybe 20 minutes. Then I noticed headlights approaching in my rearview mirror. At first I assumed it was another camper looking for a spot, but the vehicle slowed down as it approached my car. It was an old white van, no windows on the sides, just plain white. The van stopped about 30 feet behind me with its headlights still on. I remember immediately feeling uneasy because there was literally no reason for someone to stop directly behind my car in an otherwise empty area. I waited for maybe a minute, expecting the driver to either pass me or park somewhere else, but they didn't move. Eventually, I started my engine again, figuring I'd just leave and find another spot. The second my brake lights came on, the van's headlights shut off completely. That scared me enough that I pulled out immediately and drove back toward the main road. The van stayed where it was. At least I thought it did. About 5 minutes later, I glanced in my mirror and saw headlights far behind me on the dirt road. Same height, same spacing. The van was following me. I tried convincing myself it was coincidence, but every turn I made, the van made too. The road eventually split into two directions. One led back toward the highway, while the other continued deeper into the forest. I took the highway route without signaling, hoping the van would continue straight. Instead, it turned behind me immediately. That's when I knew something was wrong. My chest got tight and I started speeding up. The dirt road was rough and narrow though, so I couldn't go too fast without risking crashing. The van kept a steady distance behind me the entire time. Not gaining, not falling back, just staying there. Then my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it because I was panicking already, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was a woman, maybe in her 40s. She sounded terrified. Before I could even say hello, she said, "Do not pull over. Keep driving." I remember yelling back asking who she was, but she ignored the question and asked if a white van was behind me. My stomach dropped instantly. I said yes. She told me she was driving several cars behind us and had seen the van parked near my car earlier with its lights off. She said she watched someone get out of the van and stand beside my vehicle for several minutes before getting back in when I started driving away. Hearing that made my entire body go cold. I asked why she was calling me specifically, and she said she'd seen a local business decal on the back of my car and searched the company online until she found the store number. One of my co-workers had apparently answered and gave her my name after she claimed it was an emergency. Even now, that level of determination from a complete stranger still blows my mind. She told me not to drive home because the people in the van would then know where I lived. Instead, she instructed me to head toward a gas station near the highway where there'd be cameras and people around. The van stayed behind me the whole drive. At one point it got close enough that I could see there were at least two people inside. I couldn't make out faces though, just silhouettes. The woman stayed on the phone the entire time. She sounded genuinely scared for me. When we finally reached the paved highway, I thought the van might back off, but it didn't. It actually got closer. That's when things escalated. The van suddenly flashed its headlights several times before swerving partially into the other lane like it was trying to force me to pull over. I started freaking out completely at that point. The woman on the phone kept telling me to stay calm and keep driving straight to the gas station. It was only about 10 minutes away, but it felt like an hour. Then the van accelerated suddenly and pulled beside me. I looked over for maybe half a second and saw the driver staring directly at me. Middle-aged guy, thin face, no expression at all. The passenger was wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Neither of them looked away. The van stayed beside me for several seconds before suddenly dropping back again. I remember thinking they were deciding whether or not to hit my car off the road. When I finally saw the gas station lights ahead, I almost cried from relief. There were several cars parked there, thankfully, including a police SUV near the entrance. The second the van spotted the police vehicle, it slowed down hard. Then it made a sudden U-turn across the highway and disappeared back into the darkness. I pulled into the gas station shaking so badly I could barely stand. The woman who'd called me arrived maybe 2 minutes later in a silver SUV. She was exactly how I imagined from her voice. Middle-aged, visibly shaken, constantly checking over her shoulder while talking to the officer. She explained everything she'd witnessed, including seeing the driver standing outside my car earlier. The officer took it seriously enough that additional patrol units searched the area for the van, but they never found it. Here's the part that still bothers me the most, though. While speaking with the officer, the woman suddenly asked me something strange. She asked if I'd noticed anything attached to my car when I got back in earlier. I said no. She walked to the rear bumper and crouched down with her flashlight. Stuck underneath my car with duct tape was a small GPS tracker. The officer removed it carefully while I just stood there frozen. If that woman hadn't called me, I honestly don't know what would have happened. The police later told me similar trackers had been found in a couple of stalking-related cases around Arizona over the years, though they couldn't prove this incident was connected. Nothing ever came from the investigation. No suspects, no arrests. The van completely vanished. I tried getting back to normal afterward, but for months I was terrified any time a vehicle stayed behind me too long at night. I started checking under my car constantly before driving anywhere. The weirdest part is that about 3 weeks after the incident, I saw the same older man from the convenience store again. Same gray beard, same baseball cap. He was standing outside the store smoking when I pulled in for gas. The second he recognized me, his expression changed completely. Not surprise exactly, more like disappointment. He got into a pickup truck immediately and drove away before I could even process what was happening. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe it wasn't. But I never went back to that store again, and I haven't driven those forest roads at night since. Sometimes I still think about how close I came to disappearing without anybody ever knowing why. And the only reason I'm here to tell this story is because one stranger decided to get involved instead of minding her own business. I never used to believe those stories about people hearing things outside their house at night and realizing someone had been watching them for weeks. I always assumed there had to be warning signs the person ignored or exaggerated details afterward because they were scared. After what happened to me, I understand how easily something terrifying can slowly become normal without you realizing it. This happened in November of 2023 when I was living in a small town outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. I was 26 then and renting the upstairs portion of an old farmhouse that had been converted into 2 separate apartments. The downstairs unit was occupied by an older couple named Ray and Linda who mostly kept to themselves. The property sat near the edge of a wooded area with only one neighboring house visible from the driveway. During the day, it honestly looked peaceful. At night, though, the entire area became unbelievably dark. There were no streetlights, barely any traffic, and the woods behind the house stretched for miles. I worked late shifts at a warehouse, so most nights I didn't get home until after midnight. Usually I'd microwave food, watch YouTube for an hour, then go to sleep. Nothing about my routine ever changed, which is probably why it took me so long to notice something was wrong. The first strange thing happened on a Tuesday night after work. I remember getting out of my car and hearing what sounded like footsteps somewhere in the woods behind the house. Not animal movement either, actual footsteps crunching through leaves. I froze for a second listening, but after a few moments the sound stopped completely. I figured it was probably a deer, or maybe even Ray walking around outside. I went upstairs and didn't think much of it afterward. Over the next couple of weeks, though, little things started happening that slowly made me uneasy. Sometimes when I arrived home, I'd notice the motion light near the back of the house already turned on before I even stepped out of my car. Other times I'd hear movement outside my bedroom window late at night, but whenever I looked, there'd be nothing there. I tried convincing myself it was just animals because the property backed up against heavy woods. Then one night I noticed muddy footprints on the outside steps leading to my apartment. They weren't fresh enough to panic over, but they definitely weren't mine. What bothered me was the fact the prints stopped directly outside my front door. I mentioned it casually to Ray the next morning, expecting him to brush it off, but instead, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. He asked if I'd been hearing noises outside at night too. The second he said that, my stomach tightened. Apparently, Linda had been hearing tapping sounds near their bedroom window after midnight for almost a month. Ray thought teenagers were messing around on the property, but he'd never actually seen anyone. He told me to keep my doors locked just in case. After that conversation, I became hyper-aware of every sound outside. I started checking the windows constantly before bed. Most nights everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake this growing feeling that someone was watching the house. Around that time, I also began noticing something weird with my trash cans. Every Thursday night, I'd wheel them to the end of the driveway for pickup, and almost every Friday morning, one of the lids would be partially open, even though the garbage had already been collected. At first, I assumed raccoons were getting into them, but eventually I realized nothing inside had been disturbed. The lids were just open, like someone had looked through them. The night everything changed started completely normal. It was a Friday, and I got home from work around 1:15 a.m. It had been raining lightly all evening, and the entire property was covered in fog. I remember because my headlights barely cut through it while driving up the gravel driveway. As soon as I parked, I noticed the back motion light was already on again. That immediately put me on edge, because it usually only activated if something moved behind the house. I stayed in my car for probably 30 seconds, staring toward the backyard. Nothing was there. Eventually, I grabbed my backpack and hurried upstairs. Around 2 a.m., while I was watching videos in bed, I heard 3 slow knocks on my window. Not the front door. My bedroom window. The sound was soft but deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. Every muscle in my body locked up instantly. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor. There was no balcony outside the window, nothing anyone could stand on. I remember just sitting there frozen, staring toward the curtains while my heart hammered in my chest. After maybe 10 seconds, it happened again. 3 more knocks. Slow. Controlled. I grabbed my phone and turned off the video I was watching so the room became completely silent. Then I heard breathing outside the window. Very faint, but definitely there. I don't think I've ever felt fear like that before. I slowly backed away from the bed and left the bedroom without looking through the curtains. I went downstairs and banged on Ray and Linda's door until Ray answered looking half asleep. The second he saw my face, he knew something was wrong. I explained about the knocking, and without even questioning me, he grabbed a flashlight and a shotgun from inside the house. We went outside together into the cold, foggy darkness behind the property. At first, we didn't see anything. The woods were completely silent except for dripping rainwater from the trees. Then, Ray's flashlight landed on something near the tree line about 30 yards behind the house. A ladder. An old wooden ladder leaning against the back wall directly beneath my bedroom window. My stomach dropped instantly. Someone had carried a ladder through the woods and positioned it under my window while I was inside. Ray walked toward it cautiously while shining the flashlight around. That's when we heard movement deeper in the woods, fast movement, like someone running through wet leaves. Ray yelled into the darkness asking who was there, but nobody answered. We called the police immediately afterward. While waiting for them, Ray inspected the ladder more closely and found muddy handprints along the sides. The police arrived maybe 20 minutes later and searched the woods, but they didn't find anyone. What they did find terrified me even more. About 50 yards into the trees behind the house, officers discovered a small campsite hidden between thick brush. There was a sleeping bag, empty food containers, bottles of water, and piles of cigarette butts. Whoever had been there had clearly stayed for days, maybe longer. But the worst part was finding photographs scattered inside a plastic bag near the campsite. Pictures of the house, pictures of my car, pictures of me leaving for work. Some had obviously been taken from the woods without my knowledge. There was even one photo of me standing in my kitchen at night through the window. I remember feeling physically sick when the officer showed us. The police believed someone had been living in the woods behind the property and watching the house for weeks. They suspected the person escalated that night by attempting to look through my bedroom window using the ladder. But they never caught whoever it was. No fingerprints matched anyone in the system, and the rain destroyed most of the tracks around the campsite. I stayed with a friend for the next few nights while the landlord installed floodlights and additional locks around the property. About a week later, I went back to collect more of my belongings during the afternoon. While packing clothes in my bedroom, I noticed something carved into the wooden frame outside the window. I swear this is true. Someone had scratched the words, "I saw you sleeping," into the paint beneath the sill. I moved out that same weekend. A few months later, Ray called me unexpectedly. He sounded shaken. He told me another ladder had been found behind the house one night after I left. Same spot beneath my old window. But this time, there were muddy footprints leading away from it toward the woods. Only one set. Barefoot footprints. I still think about that sometimes when I'm awake late at night. The idea that someone could hide that close to your home for weeks without you knowing. Watching your routines, learning when you sleep, waiting outside your window in the dark while you sit inside completely unaware. Even now, anytime I hear unexpected noises outside after midnight, my mind immediately goes back to those 3 slow knocks on the glass above my bed.